Hello friends, welcome to the Soviet Journey channel. At this station of our journey, I wanted to tell you about daily life in the Soviet Union and how Soviet people spent their lives. The topics we will cover in our video titled Lifestyle in the Soviets will be the general mental structures of Soviet citizens, their individual or collective life activities, social and cultural relations, communications, behavioral patterns, habits and ways of thinking. In this video, I will explain consumption habits, fashion and cultural structures with visuals. In short, the social, economic, daily and cultural conditions specific to the people living in the Soviet Union will be waiting for you. According to Marxist teaching, the socialist lifestyle progresses parallel to the class struggle experienced during the construction and development of socialism after the victory of the Socialist Revolution, and this lifestyle goes hand in hand with the goal of communism. In other words, the aim and ideal of the Soviet people in their lifestyle should be to eliminate class differences and therefore exploitation by planning the development of socialism. Accordingly, in the socialist way of life, there is the principle of unity of workers, peasants and intellectuals of all nations. There is public control of property and all socio-economic conditions are determined by the people in a participatory manner. The founding purpose of the Soviets, which formed the basis of the Soviet Union and meant council, was for the people to govern themselves and make decisions. I have previously explained this issue in detail in my video titled Leadership in the USSR. You can access that video from the link on the top right. The quality of life of the Soviet people was determined by the people through the Soviets, the main governing body, not by another ruling class. Issues such as cultural lifestyle, behavioral patterns, and ideals were determined in line with all the needs of the people. After this seemingly confusing introduction, let's go into more detail to make it more understandable and explain with examples what kind of lifestyle the Soviet people had in concrete terms. Take your tea or coffee with you and enjoy this live video. Here is the characteristic lifestyle of the Soviet people. First of all, we need to talk about the main themes that are generally accepted among all Soviet citizens. The first of these, as a reflection of socialist views, is that everyone should make a social effort, that is, work. It was never accepted in the Soviets for someone to live off the labor of others without contributing or working for society. Therefore, there was no person in the Soviet Union who could be described as not working, idle, and making a living by exploiting others. If someone is not working, they either have a health problem, have used their vacation rights, or a similar situation exists. In the Soviet Union, a person's effort to do something was considered a duty for the progress of all humanity, and for this reason, labor always existed as the highest value in Soviet society. Another generally accepted characteristic is loyalty to the socialist homeland. In the Soviet Union, a person's effort to do something was considered a duty for the progress of all humanity, and therefore labor was always the highest value in Soviet society. Every Soviet citizen knew that their country was trying to build socialism despite great difficulties. The losses during the Russian Civil War that broke out after the October Revolution, the subsequent hostilities of all capitalist Western countries against the Soviet Union, the massacres that followed when their countries were invaded by the Nazis during World War II, and finally the all-out attack by the entire Western world under the leadership of the United States during the Cold War. All of these examples greatly increased the solidarity awareness of Soviet citizens and led them to come together. The issue of protecting the common homeland of all Soviet peoples against capitalists and exploiters has always been a non-negotiable issue. For this reason, devotion to the Soviet homeland, which has paid great prices for socialism and the welfare of the people, is one of the most accepted characteristics of the Soviet people. In connection with this, loving all the nations of the world without discrimination, that is, internationalism, has been accepted as another general principle. It has always been argued that all workers in the world are equal on the basis of class brotherhood and that there is no difference in terms of labor. For this reason, being an enemy of the people, insulting the values of a people, or harboring hostility towards people with nationalist thoughts has been considered one of the greatest crimes. Everything cultural has been seen as wealth and has been promoted, but historically any activity that could cause discrimination between peoples has been prohibited. The Soviet people, aware of the importance of their country to world peace, attached special importance to this issue. Another common feature of Soviet people is their acceptance of the principle of organized society. Living insensitively as an individual has never been welcomed in Soviet society, and it has always been emphasized that people should produce their products collectivistically. In addition, being active for society, at least in organizations such as a local association or trade union, was an honorable behavior in Soviet society. The contribution of individuals, even at the smallest level, to the progress of society was a very meaningful act. Acting in hundreds of areas, from small organizations such as associations to large organizations such as local governments or Communist Party activities, was the most common behavior among Soviet people. This type of behavior is explained by social sensitivity. In the Soviet Union, it has always been considered a great virtue to think about the life of someone other than one's own. This doctrine of solidarity stemmed from Marxist doctrine, and almost every Soviet person was in a position to consider the needs of their neighbors and convey them to the relevant authorities. Therefore, the culture of solidarity became a generally accepted lifestyle of the Soviet people. What we understand when we say lifestyle and consumption habits is very important. As a matter of fact, humanity had a certain amount of material wealth and consumption habits at every stage of its development. But historically, there has been a huge inequality between classes in accessing this wealth. The Soviet Union aimed to quickly close this inequality and distribute social wealth more fairly and equally among the people. The perception of living standards of people living in capitalist Western countries and the socialist Soviet Union is very different from each other. Both sides use different indicators when characterizing the standard of living of their people. For example, in the United States, people generally tend to measure the standard of living by the number of cars and their cost, while Soviet people generally care about the number of free services provided to all citizens. Soviet people's access to consumer goods was directly proportional to their social labor. As a rule, a country house was first granted to a Soviet citizen working in any profession under the right to housing law. Access to a house with living space was the most accessible need for Soviet people. A house could also be provided in cities according to personal, professional, or social needs. The priority of meeting household needs was also based on professional and social foundations. For example, a security guard would be given a motorcycle immediately, while a teacher who did not need it professionally would be given consumer goods based on professional needs, such as sports equipment or recording devices, instead of a motorcycle. I translated and presented to you the table regarding the priorities of various social segments in accessing consumer products in a study conducted in the Soviet Union in 1969. According to this table, the peak of the consumer ideal of the Soviet people at that time was generally cars, refrigerators, and furniture. With the advancement of technology, all these consumer goods were delivered to the Soviet people through mass production, and a large proportion of the population owned these household goods. In 1975, 74% of the Soviet population had a television, 62% had a refrigerator, and 65% had a washing machine. If we talk about food habits, Soviet cuisine had a very rich content. This richness stems from the fact that it hosts many different nations and cultures and the interaction of these cultures with each other. There is a documentary video on our channel where I explain Soviet culinary culture in more detail. Those who are interested can watch our Soviet cuisine video from the link on the top right. Although the food habits of Soviet citizens varied greatly, they also had some things in common. The food culture described as eat several times a day, do not eat anything between meals was a general approach, and the eating habit of 4 meals in a row was generally accepted. The first meal consisted of liquid foods such as soup, the second meal consisted of meat, fish, and side dishes such as potatoes and pasta. The third meal consisted of beverages such as tea, coffee, milk and kefir, and the fourth meal consisted of desserts. As beverages, Soviet citizens consumed a large amount of tea and kefir made from baker's yeast. Let's talk a little about the fashion habits of Soviet people. I also published an extensive documentary video about Soviet fashion. Those who want to get detailed information can access the video from the link on the top right. Soviet fashion was not perceived as a symbol of privilege or prestige as in Western countries. Soviet citizens writing in fashion magazines argued that people should be judged by the work they do, not their physical appearance. Fashion suggestions appropriate to the region and culture were made by the people living there, and then state textile factories produced clothes in accordance with these trends. If we examine it on a yearly basis, in the years after the October Revolution, ostentatious bourgeois elements in clothing were sharply abandoned and became simpler. For example, the bourgeois bowler hat was abandoned and replaced by caps described as proletarian hats. In the 1930s, women's fashion in particular became richer and became comparable to Western fashion in terms of diversity. During this period, it was fashionable for women to lighten their hair color. Then, from the post-World War II period until the 1960s, wide and bright trousers, baggy jackets and hats dominated Soviet youth. In the 1960s, wide-legged skinny trousers, also known as flare pants, became fashionable for both men and women. This type of trousers was called bell-bottom trousers in the Soviet Union. With the development of ties with the West in the 1970s, jeans and Indian saris began to become fashionable for Soviet people in these years. Turtleneck sweaters imitating Ernest Hemingway became popular among the intelligentsia. Then, with the perestroika policies in the 1980s, the punk style of clothing scene in Western countries became fashionable for young people. At the same time, fluffy hair and fur fashion were other fashion elements that attracted attention in these years. If we compare the cultural life in the Soviet Union with the period of the Russian Empire, we see that it has changed radically. And we see that the intellectual class responsible for cultural affairs is now from the working class who produce surplus value. Especially after the 1930s, with industrialization and collectivization, the cultural structure of society changed significantly and an artistic method called socialist realism emerged. This method describes the ideal of communism, and the consciousness of building a socialist society is conveyed by highlighting the working class, industrialization, the brotherhood of the peoples of the world, and revolutionary heroes in works of art. For example, works such as Maxim Gorky's novel The Mother, the Worker and Kolka's Woman statue, or Raising the Flag painting can be considered among the important representatives of this movement. Gorky published a famous article titled Socialist Realism in 1933 and enumerated 4 principles for this movement. These principles were generally accepted in the later period. Being proletarian, that is, it contains art that is relevant to workers and understandable to them. Being typical, that is, it contains scenes from people's daily lives. Being realistic, that is, it is based on reality in a representative sense. And being partisan, it is in a way that supports the aims of the state and the party. Serving the public, explaining socialism, presenting people with the real thing and encouraging creativity were the prominent topics in Soviet arts. In addition, cultural heritage of nations and multinationality were other important concepts. In order to preserve the visual heritage, great importance was given to museums and exhibition buildings in the Soviet Union. In 1918, Lenin issued a decree stating that sculpture production would be supported, and in a short time, Soviet sculptors of the period built many monuments on revolutionary and cultural subjects. During every period of the Soviet Union, numerous museums were built in all Soviet republics to pass on the historical and cultural heritage to future generations. Similarly, Soviet posters covering many subjects such as culture, politics, science and art had a great impact on the masses and became among the most important representatives of Soviet visual arts thanks to their important functional form. Another visual art element is the cinema and television culture in the Soviet Union. I've published a video about Soviet television, so you can watch that topic in our video on the top right, titled Soviet Television Culture. The theme of cinema is another field of visual arts that played a major role in the cultural development of the Soviet people. Lenin declared, "For us, the most important of all arts is cinema," and emphasized its importance in gaining socialist consciousness of the masses. In 1923, activities began for each Soviet republic to establish its own national film studio, and the field of cinema progressed. Workers' cinema, which called for world revolution, also aroused interest in Western countries. The works of Dziga Vertov and Sergei Eisenstein resonated worldwide and influenced the development of world cinema. Today, these works are still academically studied as masterpieces. If we take a look at Soviet literature, the most striking thing is that it was a multilingual literature and that it fully reflected the cultures of the people. Therefore, in addition to Russian, Soviet literature also included folk literature in 130 languages spoken in the Soviet Union. People who had no written literature before the Soviet Union gained their national literature and took their place on the stage of history. We can summarize the spirit of Soviet literature in three main ways: internationalist content with national diversity, with Leninist principles, and based on the socialist realism method. The Soviet government adopted a resolution in 1925 called on policies in the field of fiction, dividing all writers into two parts. The first group is the proletarians, peasants and their comrades. The second group was anti-labor and counter-revolutionaries. Worker-peasant writers and intellectual comrades were supported. The activities of anti-labor, pro-bourgeois writers, most of whom were from the Russian Tsarist period, were not allowed. This literary distinction was popular in the 1920s and 1930 seconds, when the remnants of the anti-worker bourgeoisie were collapsing and class struggle was intense. However, after the complete abolition of the exploiting classes, this distinction disappeared and all literature began to be studied under the name Soviet literature. Now the entire literary world in the Soviet Union was moving with the socialist realism movement. Soviet literature continued to explain the working class, industrialization, internationalism, and socialism to all humanity. Many musical art forms emerged in the musical field, and thanks to the principle of multilingual music, every people living in the Soviet Union expressed their culture through musical works. Thanks to the public music education system, countless composers and musicians were trained in the Soviet Union. Many philharmonic societies were established, such as Moscow, Kaliningrad, and Leningrad. In addition to the Soviet opera and ballet, countless orchestras and musical ensembles continued to perform for years. Today's Red Army Choir is still a representative of this heritage. One of the most important issues in the musical field is the ability to reach the masses. In the Soviet Union, the songs were easily accessible to the public, and in cooperation with Soviet cinema, the songs were turned into film soundtracks, thus increasing their public awareness. I have published many documentary videos about Soviet music on our channel, and you can access that video list from the link on the top right. Yes, comrades, in this video, I tried to explain the lifestyle of the Soviet people with various topics. When we say lifestyle in the Soviets, we should not think of today's lifestyle in terms of classical thinking. This lifestyle includes the basic values and ideals of a people walking towards a socialist goal and many ideological infrastructures such as equality, devotion, friendship, moral relations, and education. Although lifestyle in capitalist culture is used in the sense of living a different life from other people, in the Soviet Union this was the opposite and was based on thinking about other people. That is why, in various scientific studies, the Soviet lifestyle is examined at the level of the most sociologically developed countries. Today, Soviet daily life is still the subject of many researchers, and it is wondered how people living in socialist culture spend their days. In this video, I tried to tell you what you are wondering about this subject. I hope you enjoyed our informative video on the subject and that we received a like from you. If you have anything you would like to add to the topic, please comment below. Let's examine and discuss together. On our Soviet Journey channel, I publish many documentary-like videos about the Soviet Union and world socialist movements. I recommend friends who want to take a look at our other documentary videos to visit our channel. Please do not forget to subscribe to our channel to stay tuned with us. See you again in other videos. Goodbye for now. Stay in solidarity.